I have a strong feeling of belonging to the last car of the last train of that culture. In France, I lived in a tiny village in the valley in the Pyrenees. Let us say, my experience of the world was very reduced. I had never passed from Toulouse, 80 kilometers from the village. On the south, the Estelas, 1,300 meters. On the other side, the Barbute. Between the Estelas and the Barbute, well, 5 kilometers in straight line, and nothing more. And suddenly, in question of 2 days, they carry me. There is no other world. They put me in a train first. It was the first time I had a night in the train. Then they put me on a plane, and Breguet de Pont. When I told all the specialists of the history of planes, I flew Breguet de Pont. They looked at me, admired. And reaching Tunis, the airport, Tunis airport, and seeing for the first time women with a white veil covering them from the top of their head to their feet. Nothing to do with the present day black veil of the extremist, the integrist Muslim. No, the traditional white veil. This shocked me. And then to a village, a big village or a small city, depends as you call it, called Jemal, a very rural village. Till now in Tunisia, when you speak of Jemal, immediately this evokes for them, well, olive trees, fundamentally, because Jemal was covered with olive trees. It was a strange experience in the way that, well, first I did not understand what people were saying, first. You do not imagine when you have been used all your life to understand, and suddenly, I have never been out, I insist. And second, after a year in Jemal, we passed to Sousse, a bigger city, and there I grew aware of something absolutely fundamental for me later, the importance of religion to define oneself. There were 3 religions, Muslims obviously, a huge Jewish community, and an appreciable number of French Catholics for the most part. We lived together without any problem, but we knew we did not belong to the same community. The first thing you try to discover when you met something is religion. Being French was to be a Christian and go to the parish, even the Protestants. Being a Jew, obviously, and being a Muslim, going to the mosque. We met, we worked together, but don't think of having an affair with a girl or with a boy of another community. It was a strict rule, I should not say a rule, a convention. For me, it was not shocking, because in my village in the Ariège, religion was very important. But seeing it from now, I feel how much I was marked by that. And then, what should I say? I appreciated really post-colonial situation.
The post-colonial situation?
Yeah.
Why?
It was fine. First, All the Tunisian elites, all of them dreamed of one thing, to become French culturally, and if possible to get a French passport. So that being French was immediately and without any other merit belonging to the elite, simply. And people treated you as such. The second point was I felt what was poverty. Tunisia at that time was one of the poorest countries in the world, well, better say, the poorest country among countries who had statistics. But in fact, it was not brilliant. I never saw people dying of hunger, no, but people who ate meat once a year, I saw, and eggs twice. I saw people living on bread and oil and salt. I saw people unable to travel to any part because they strictly had no money to pay the bus to go to the city, and things like that. This, I believe that if you did not see it, you cannot imagine it when you see that in the documents. Third, I for the first time appreciated, but this is ironic, dictature. Bourguiba was creating then dictatorship in Tunisia, bland dictatorship, but the dictatorship, the chief was a chief, and the other ones, please shut up. Well, there were happy times, because being a member of a community meant that the community was around you. You rarely were alone. We had silence on.
Did the post-colonial status, going from a colony to independence, did that weaken the importance of communities, or were they equally strict?
They were equally strict. They began falling a piece some years after I was back to France. They fell a piece because many French who were there went away. This doesn't mean that there are less Europeans in Tunisia. Nonetheless, some of the new ones were tourists. It is not the same. And second, the Jewish community practically disappeared in the 60s.
And why did the Jews leave Tunisia?
The Jews left Tunisia because they had been, during the colonization, the go-betweens between France and Tunisia. They had copped the administrative positions in the Tunisian administration. You know, they knew French, they knew Arabic. They had no inconvenience in getting a French passport, which a Tunisian did not do. I believe that some 15 Tunisians asked for a French passport in more than a century of colonization, when they just had to ask to, but that meant renouncing their personal statute and becoming French citizen without a Muslim law to govern their family
within Tunisia.
So
It would change their legal status within Tunisia.
They had to change their legal status, their personal status. There still is today in the Tunisian Supreme Court a chamber of a personal statute. So, let's say that the post-colonial society changed because two of the main actors of it went away. Another feature went on absolutely like before, and even stronger still. It's the admiration for France and the desire Now, not to become French citizen, but to go and live to France. It is a huge problem for Tunisia. There are more Tunisian doctors in France than in Tunisia. Engineers, the same. Researchers, practically 80% of the Tunisian researchers work in France or in the United States. This is post-colonialism. It is not that the former metropolis tries to keep the hand on the country. It is simply that the elites of the country have been so used to consider former colonists as perfect, as good, fundamentally, as superior, let us say, that they go on acting as if.
So how did you feel in Tunisia? Did you feel safe? Did you feel free?
Totally safe and free. Look, every morning from Jamal, I had to take the bus to go alone. I was 12 at that time. I had to drive 40 kilometers in bus in a foreign country with nobody to take care of me. I used to walk. I like walking in the field. I went walking 40 kilometers in a day without even imagining something could happen. There was no problem. There are some tensions between children. Well, you know, when we children used to have problems with one another, immediately there came you colonialist, and from my part, you Tunisian, which you had not to precise what it meant, but an inferior. But we were even joking with that. There was some from time to time, some tension, but no, nothing serious. Not even at the time of a Bizet affair.
Tell me about that.
I was not in Tunisia at that time. I was on holidays in France.
But what year are we in now?
But I came back just after that.
What year is it?
61 or 62, I do not remember. Well, the fact was when France left Tunisia, she preserved the military area in Bizerte, in northern Tunisia, and the Tunisian, we had decided to give it back to Tunisia, but the Tunisian government decided they had to take it and not to wait for us to give it back. So they launched thousands of civilians assaulting the military base. And the French army fired. There was, nobody knows how many dead, but various hundreds. And curiously, inside Tunisia, there were not serious tensions against the French who were there. They expelled a couple of old colonialists who obviously were not at the place they had to be, but nothing more. They just delayed the opening of the French schools for a fall term, but nothing more. But this accelerated much the departure of Jews.
But you were in Tunisia during the French colonial wars.
No, it was after.
You came after?
I came in 59.
Yeah, so the war in Algeria was more or less over.
Exactly. But to give you an idea of things were there, we had the French with some Tunisian, various Tunisian, cultural club, with a senior club, with conferences and so on. In 62, they organized a debate on torture in Algeria. This you could not have done in France at that time. And there, you see, speaking quietly of such a topic in a Muslim country, there was a priest, a curate in Monastir. No, in Kilwan. He was practically alone. There were no other French in Kilwan, so that each Sunday some Catholics from Sousse went to hear him saying Mass. And I remember serving his Mass, going to the street and walking out to see the FLN troops marching to celebrate the victory. No problem. I was glad with them because they looked so glad. They didn't know what was expecting them, but this is another story.
Yeah. So, as a historian, but somebody who has lived through this period and also lived in the French colony, how do you see this colonial wars? Let's start with Vietnam. You remember this war as a boy.
I remember the first news I remember was Dien Bien Phu. But I was a very little boy. I knew there was a war there, but simply I did not understand what it was. You know, our education at that time was hugely colonial. We had a map of the French Empire in every classroom, with the French colonies in blue and the English one in red, and the master, the teacher, explaining us that England had stolen all they had to the French.
From the French?
From the French, yeah. Obviously, he never told us anything about the war in Indochina. Well, the same succeeded in telling us what had happened during the Second World War without even mentioning Marshal Pétain. You know, in Norway, without mentioning Quisling.
Oh, we heard about him, I can tell you.
Yeah.
Because we shot him, so
yeah.
You couldn't hide that.
But we did not shoot him, but we were about to.
Yeah.
So for me, it was something far away. The Algerian War was far more present because young men were drafted to go to Algeria. My uncle himself, who was serving at that time, served in Morocco and then in Algeria. We had to speak of it. There were very intense internal problems in France due to the War of Algeria. De Gaulle's coup, which took place in 1958, for me was an important moment of political awareness because it was the first time I spent the night awake with my father hearing the radio. We had no television at that time.
So you were listening to the radio and...
To the radio with my father? No, not like that. It was a big, big radio. We were seated and we were hearing what was happening. With the troops patrolling the streets in Toulouse and so on. And then in Tunisia, it was obviously for us an important topic we could not ignore. We had a war in Algeria. And the same with Tunisian. And in Tunisia, I came to Tunisia the year after the Sidi Sakiet Youssef affair, when the French Air Force bombed a marketplace in Tunisia and killed various dozens of persons, believing they were from the Algerian Liberation Army. So, and I should say, yeah, I remember the day of the independence of Algeria was a day we celebrated. Because in Tunisia, well, most French people knew we had nothing to do in Algeria any longer. But when you were in Tunisia, it was so obvious that the day of the independence of Algeria, we celebrated it. I'm not sure we were right, because many French people had to abandon Algeria in sad conditions, but the fact is, we were so alleviated.
It was over.
It was over, at least.
And then you came back to France, and eventually you went to university and you started studying. 1970 or
In 65.
at university?
Not exactly at university, at a preparatory school for that school.
Right.
I spent 2 years studying like a beast, working. You cannot imagine that. But after 2 years, I knew more Latin than a licentiate in classical humanism, more English than, yes, I've lost a bit since then, more English than any licentiate in any graduate in English literature, more philosophy than, and so on. And then I went to the university, and it was a shock, because in the preparatory class we were 30, no one more. And we had 6 teachers to take care of ourselves, of us. In the university, it was the wave of massification was coming. My generation, no, not my generation, my cohort, the people who were born the same year as myself, we were the crest of a wave of the massification. They had changed the educational system in France. Before, we had 2 different educational systems, one for the elite with few students, lycée and university, another one for the common people, primary school, middle school, and arts et métiers. Nothing of university. When they merged both, everybody went to the university. We were, in the first year of history, the first course, we were 450, I believe, in classrooms made for 200 at most. No one teacher more, no one professor more. They had to do with that. And it was a surprise. But I live in good conditions, because at that time teachers were used to know the students. And they immediately knew I was coming from one of those preparatory classes, as we call them. And as most of them had also passed by the preparatory classes system, well, immediately I was, I should not say one of the club, but something like that.
Did you choose this preparatory class, or was it chosen for you?
No. My teachers decided that. I didn't even know it existed.
So it was chosen for you by the
Exactly.
You were
this
selected.
was a French equalitarian and democratic educational system.
Which no longer exists.
Something remains.
How do you think studying history has changed from your time to today? I mean, from the student's perspective, student life.
Well, the first difference, but it is casual, is that when I studied in Toulouse, history in Toulouse, for circumstantial reasons, was one of the best European universities in history. And this, I believe, changed many things. We knew that the masters we had were world famous. Second, they were not the worst. never from a scientific point of view, and I must confess that many classes were highly interesting. Not the usual stuff you give every year to the students to feed them and keep them going. No. Many of them used to speak to us of what they were doing as researchers. They had time to do that. A factor was that I chose to study medieval and ancient history, and less students were there than in other sections. But the fact is that they took care of us. They knew our names. I don't know how they did, because we were many, but they knew them. It was, I suspect, a different relation from what we have now. Moreover, at that time, they knew that the students they had would reach positions similar to their own. We were not future out of work. No, nobody was out of work in France at that time. And in fact, all of us succeeded in getting, some of us, important positions. And this changed the relationship between us. The life of a student was, I fear, less a long holiday as it is today. We had to work more. Many of us were working to earn their living, and even those who did not do that took it maybe more seriously than I notice today. It was out of question to dance on Thursday night. On Friday night, no. Relaxing was on Saturday. We took it more seriously, if you want, studies.
Do you see this change as negative, or is it positive that they have a better life? What the famous work-life balance?
I should like some of them to work a bit more and remember that not because one is a student and statistically not a worker, not to work. Well, we had some lazy people like everybody, but we worked hard. Harder, I believe, than they do today. This was one difference. Maybe because we knew that through university studies, we would get a social position. At that time, it still was there. Being a graduate from the university gave you a right to a position, a respected position. And this has changed. So I understand him.
So, if you were a student today, you would go dancing on Thursday?
Oh, I don't know, I am, how do they call that, workaholic?
Workaholic, yeah.
Like
but you're also a ladies' man, so... So, has the relationship between the professors and the students changed, apart from that they used to know the names? Is there more familiarity now, or?
Two contradictory things. First, as I told you, they were closer to us as they used to be now. Among other things, because they still use the old ways with us in spite of the massification. But from another part, they were far off from us because they had a prestige in our eyes. We no longer have for the students. Many of them admire us, but they don't feel obliged to show you this respect. I meet a student in this school, a quarter of an hour after that, he is calling me de Dieu and Jean-Pierre. No, in our time, we would have taken the liberty to do that with Professor Godeschal, would not have lasted long in Toulouse University.
1968 is, it's not just an event, it's sort of a symbol. But you were not in Paris, you were in...
I was in Toulouse. In Toulouse, things started a week after Paris. It came not a huge movement at the beginning, but every day growing and growing till Monday 13th, in which we had a great demonstration in Toulouse, the biggest since the end of the Second World War, and suddenly I found myself a member of a service order of a CGT syndicate, wearing a helmet and a club in my hands.
This was not your plan.
And that day, it was the first time I appeared in television. The last picture, the last image, local television broadcasted before going to strike was my person with a helmet on the head and the club in my hands. When I came back to my village 3 weeks later, 3 months later, because I was occupying the university, they looked at me in a strange way. I was not aware of why. Yeah. I'm fundamentally a conservative. I hope an intelligent conservative, but fundamentally conservative. And I was reputed, they believed I was a leftist.
But this is interesting. How does a conservative young man become so involved? Is it because 1968 swept up everybody, or is it?
There are many reasons. Well, one of the main reasons were the conditions we had at the university at that time. I alluded to the fact that the massification was huge, that we had the same buildings as before, and so on. People of a section of French literature could not be housed in one classroom in the university. Impossible. They were 1,300, and the biggest place was for 1,000. It is obvious that security laws and so on we passed over. The teachers were obviously nervous because they were overworked, obviously. By the way, a generation of young historians of that time never terminated their dissertation because they had to give classes to the barbarians. This was one of the reasons of May 62. The second one was a cultural gap between what was officially required for social life and what we were doing. Well, kissing your girl in the street was absolutely, I should not say forbidden, but looked very badly. And many things of this kind. And we wanted to break these constraints. We were not alone in wanting that. Many people wanted in France, and in fact we did that in 68. A third point were that the conditions of everyday life in France were bad. France was a rich country, but the money went to inversion for the industry, for public infrastructures, and people lived straight. An American historian wrote a book about this characteristic of France from the First World War till 1968, lack of. You were not poor, but you had to be careful with what you spend and so on. And we knew on the other way that the country was growing richer every day. And the three things together led to May 68 and to my occupation of a university. Yes, being a sentinel by night on the roof of a university, just in case the righteous to attack the university to expel us from what was ours and not others.
So, did you at any point think that this is becoming too radical and withdraw, or were you involved in it all the way?
No. Well, the demands were not radical. Even today they would seem rather moderate. And there was such a consensus on what we were asking. I live apart some leftists who wanted a Trotskyist revolution or a libertarian and anarchist revolution, but those were quite easily. I learned the strategies of propaganda and agitation, agitprop as we call that. I did good use of that later, but this is another story. And fundamentally, the remembrances I have of 68 are like a great holidays.
Yeah, but it is interesting that the mass that seems so reasonable could almost topple the state.
Yes and no. What toppled the state was industrial strikes. And the state we know now was never toppled. De Gaulle lost his head at the moment, but Prime Minister Pompidou never lost it and was always in touch with the situation. We succeeded in doing that with 2 dead. The first thing the Minister of the Interior said to the police was, no dead. Everything, but I don't want dead. And we did that. A demonstration was not a violent affair as it is now. The first thing they did was to create a service of order.
Why have demonstrations become much more violent now than they were then?
Well, ask a sociologist.
Yeah, but I'm asking a brilliant historian who lived through it.
No, really, I am unable to tell you that, because the level of global violence in society has decreased. Well, when you say that, people do not believe you, but when you lived at that time, you know it. Fighting in school, even in the university, fighting with a comrade was something absolutely usual. And it did not make headlines in the newspapers. But not really, I don't know. I suspect that ourselves, the fathers of the 68 generation, did not really do a job. Our job, better said, with our sons.
So, you think this is a part of the change of relationship between parents and children?
Yeah, this is one of the explanations. Second explanation would be that no, this is the main one, I believe.
So does it?
And well, also the lack of the decreasing influence of the church and of a communist party on the other side. but is the main institution in charge of teaching youth ways to believe, not school education, but the way you had to behave. Well, it is not the same. In my youth, I belonged to various youth organizations of the church, and we all of us belonged to 2 or 3 organizations, schools, teams, whatever you want. So we were very strictly followed and cared by people whose job it was. And we took it seriously.
But still, you were more violent than young people today, except when it came to demonstrations.
Not only, yeah,
It's a paradox.
but they cannot, let us say, that in normal life, take it easy. And as soon as they are out, yeah, maybe that would be an interesting point. As I told you, when I was in Tunisia, I had to do many things alone. So I learned how to behave in case of, well, in case of not of problems, but in case of meeting with a new situation. And maybe today we are not used to that. Yeah, one thing calls powerfully my attention. When they have to present any application for something, they need to know the procedure. What are the steps? And you have to tell them this step, and when they read your letter, they'll look at this point, that point, and that point, and so on. Well, in my time it was not so. Take this paper, it is your application, you fill it, and you give me when it is over. And so nobody cared for what would be the exact procedure. We were far more confident in ourselves than we are now. And this helped us to control ourselves in case of problems. We had to solve a lot of problems by ourselves at that time. Our parents were not always around the corner to resolve the situation.
In your case, they were in the village next door.
Yeah, like in Tunisia, I had a fight with a comrade once in the street, and the policeman was there, and he called me, and I had to go to the commissariat to explain that. My father did not come with me. My mother wanted my father to go with me. My father said no, he did it. We resolved that for himself.
How old were you?
Yeah, today you cannot imagine that.
How old were you?
I was 15.
So Jean-Pierre is a youth criminal. Young offender, sorry.
Maybe still on fire.
Probably.
Yeah. And we were the two fighters together in the commissariat, wishing to be in some other place.
You have a feeling of coming from a different time.
Absolutely. I have a strong feeling of belonging to the last car of the last train of that culture.
And are you glad that that culture is dead? Is it better now, or was it better then?
Already in the times of Plato and Aristotle, people of my age used to say it was better before. So I not say it.
I have a colleague at the University of Bergen who says our main job as professors of history is to teach young people everything used to be worse. Hygiene,
Yeah.
toothache, jobs, living conditions.
Yeah, this world we have lost. They wrote a book about that.
But what is your personal feeling?
My personal feeling is a mixed feeling. I'm glad not to live long enough. I'll probably be dead when this world, which is now just coagulating, just creating itself, will come to maturity. I suspect I would not like it much. But from another part, I am so happy to have computers, to be able to do things I could not do before.
To be allowed to marry your wife.
Eh?
To be allowed
To be allowed to marry my wife, because that sense of community which prevented us went away, faded away. Well, anyway, I have no choice. I have to take it as it comes.
Yes, but there is a tendency sometimes to romanticize the past and to forget that the past had many sides we would not appreciate today.
I was explaining to a colleague just half an hour ago. She told me the same. Pierre, what do you think of the past? And I told her, there is no reality without an observer. So the reality depends much on the observer. 50 years ago, my eyes were far more sparkling, joyful, and keen than they are now. So the reality was different, simply.
What do you think has changed most for you in how you look at the world?
In winter, houses are not cold. There are no longer flies. Really, I am not joking. For me, the two big changes are those. Flies are not an agreeable animal when you have dozens in your house. This has disappeared completely. And being cold at home is not in the Pyrenees. In the winters of 1956, I was in charge of lighting the fire in the classroom at that time, and one morning I came and I found the ink frozen in the bottle, frozen. I had to put the bottles on the fire to make it melt before beginning class. The master begins his class at 9 o'clock with something like 5 degrees in the classroom. You feel happy when this no longer happens to you.
So, has your view of women changed from when you were a young man?
When I was in my village, women were mothers, aunts, and widows. Many widows. Women were usually in black, because when it was not for a father, it was for the husband, or for the mother, or for the uncle, or for the cousin, in black. Women in my village, it is my experience in my youth, were supposedly subdued by men. In fact, they commanded. The Pyrenean women are used to be obeyed by the children and by the men. I had, obviously, the views young men of that time had about women's desire, obviously. Repressed desire, which made it still more, you got steam from inside. We were afraid of women and they were afraid of us because we had no preservatives and anticonceptional means, so that let us say, a quarter of pleasure you could have to pay for your life. Well, just before the beginning of a strike in '68, we began on Monday, I said. On Saturday, we married a comrade who had to marry in those conditions. The boy had no intention to marry that girl had no intention to marry that boy, but they had to because of social demand. Obviously, men had to command in society, at least to get the position, the commanding position. This was obvious.
Even though the women commanded at home.
They commanded at home, but not public position. A woman at the head of a university was unthinkable.
But was this something that you met also in Tunisia and in Spain? The same concept of women commanding at home and men commanding outside, or?
Yes, in both countries I found that. And this has changed a lot. They still command at home. Well, I prefer to shut up, because what I was about to say is not politically correct.
You can say it, and if it doesn't bear publishing, then
something I got was a great respect for women, which I had not when I was young. That is intellectual respect. I respected them because they were powerful at home and I loved my family and so on. But I could not admire professionally a woman.
When did that change?
That changed for one woman when I was a teenager. I fell in love with a brilliant pupil of my college, but it was for one. It changed in the 80s.
So late, 1980s, yeah.
You know, laws on forbidding women to do a lot of things without the license of the husband and so on changed in France in mid-70s with Giscard d'Estaing. I remember marriage in which the mayor read the woman the articles of the civil code. The husband decides the residence and the woman is obliged to follow him. The woman will have no job without a written license of the husband still there. Yeah.
I actually thought that was just Spain under Franco. I wasn't aware that it was France.
Franco Spain was not so different from France. Let us say, they went on saying what we used to say in France before, 10 years more longer than we did.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, there was no great difference. And obviously in Spain, women commanded.
Obviously.
And they did not care much for what men said, out of respect.
So you had this change in your opinion of women's intellect in the 1980s. Was that at the same time as the rest of France, do you think, or?
Well, my part of France, southwest, was not the more, well, I should not say it was backwards, but it was not the most modern part of France. And my village was backward.
Villages usually are, but so you became a historian at a time when the French Communist Party in many ways dominated intellectual life. When one reads the autobiographies of many of the most famous historians who are just a little bit older than you, then so many of them have been members of the Communist Party. How do you feel that shaped the profession?
The profession was not shaped by the Communist Party. Many professors was member of the Communist Party. much less believed in communism. But the question was not communism, it was a way of studying social phenomena, which was very close to Marxist ideas. Well, I should say current Marxism, not exactly the top people who really knew Marx thinking. Look, a man like Brodel was a staunch anti-communist. He was even paid by America, yeah, we know that, to create the School of Annals, to be a counterfeit to the communist dominance in the intellectual world. But if you read Brodel, you don't see much difference with a communist. Things changed in the, well, I was one of those who contributed to the change. At the end of, they began to change in the 70s. When I was in Toulouse, my masters organized an international congress at a time when organizing an international congress was not so easy as it is today. Yeah. They organized an international congress on feudalism. Feudalism was a catchword to say Marxist view of society. And they organized it, it was in 71 or 72. And it was the first event in France which put, critically examined the way we had of doing history after Marx. And then things began to change. And at the end of the 80s, there we were.
So one thing that I see sometimes is that people who belong to a certain political grouping are sometimes very exclusionary to people who have other political views. Did you experience that with?
No, within a corporation, I did not personally experience that. Oh, better say. Well, it was a bit more complicated. It is a personal remembrance. I had to apply 3 times to become a member of a CNRS. I know, because they told me after, that I had been, the first time already, my application would be classified number 1 or number 2. But only 1/3 of the members of the tribunal had seen me, because they had so many people to see that they organized commissions. I was working on the Inquisition. Suspicious. I was backed by a professor from Bordeaux who liked me. I was not his pupil, I never had been. His name was Pierre Poussou, Jean-Pierre Poussou, who was a notorious reactionary. But reactionary, really. And the one with the other, 2/3 of a commission, blackballed me. The second year, I passed in front of the same commission. The third year, a friend spoke to the president of the tribunal, and they changed the commission. And I had 2-1 and became a member of the CNRS. I should not say it was directly political, but obviously they did not want too many rightists on board. Although the year before they had recruited a friend of mine who was frankly rightist, working on the Spanish army, everything you wanted. So it is complex. And when I myself was a member of a committee of recruitment of a CNRS, we never had any problem of this kind. Simply.
That's very good. So I thought of something when we were talking, and that is, in some way, there's a similarity between your background and that of Pierre Bourdieu. You both have this North African colonial background that shaped a lot
And
of...
we were born in the same area.
Yeah,
And we have the same accent in French.
yes. But you have... Do you think you have similar or different views of community? You both have your community.
In many love. I like very much Bourdieu's work. Not the most famous, but his first work on Algeria. There, obviously, he understood what was a peasant community. And he was able to theorize on that, to build on that, a sociological theory, which I admire really. I admire less the second Bourdieu, a man who was resentful. Bourdieu all his life was resentful because in spite of becoming a member of the highest intellectual elite in France, he was never a member of a club. He had not the codes. And they let him feel that even when he was a professor in the Collège de France. You know, ways of behaving with your colleague, showing him the shoulder. I myself was never resentful for nothing. I have not exactly the same background as Bourdieu. The community was very similar. The area is very similar. But Bourdieu's parents were not poor people, but farmers. From my side, doctors and engineers. You know, it is not exactly the same. It gives you some confidence. Yeah, when I was young, I was the son of, the grandson of, and the future leader of a community. And they treated me as such. I could enter half the houses in the village and ask for a supper. They will, put the supper and glory. So, let us say that I have a degree of self-confidence Bourdieu probably never had. I say it like that. By the way, Bourdieu's resentment was a positive resentment. This helped him to do what he did. Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned various times that my life experience had been useful for me in my studies in history.
And this is where I see some similarity also, because
Yeah.
for him, his time in Algeria was formative,
Yeah,
and
it
your
was,
time in Tunisia was formative.
Yeah, for Brodel too.
Mm.
Brodel was also a professor in Lycée d'Alger.
Yeah.
And this obviously shaped his vision of the world.
Is that part of why French intellectual life was so vibrant in this time? Was it the colonial experience, the colonial influences? France had an intellectual position that it no longer has. But was that a byproduct of the colonists, do you think?
I don't know. What I know is that practically all the person of my generation and of the previous one I intellectually admire, and a background of having lived at least some time out of France, most of them in the colonies. You know, it changes your mind. It opens it up. My best friend in Bordeaux, a geographer, Guichard, was the son of Protestant missionary. He spent his 7 or 8 first years in a Negro village in some Ghana or some place like that. And obviously it is an experience which gives you, you go a step before your companions, at least. And you understand things that simply do not understand. And not directly from necessarily from what you saw, but the fact of having touched, literally touched, another culture.
Very good. So, final question, I think. No, I have two more. First, oligarchy. You have spent some part of your life studying oligarchy.
And I have been a member of a Tunisian oligarchy.
How did that change your perception of historical oligarchy?
It confirmed my experience. Well, no, not only in Spain, in Tunisia. In Tunisia, I was a full member of a Tunisian oligarchy. When I met again the woman who is my wife now, it was around the beginning, the last year of the last century. But being a full member of a Tunisian oligarchy, that is the president knowing my name, spending much time with ministers, writing reports for the president because I wrote French better than many ministers in Tunisia, being consulted even on political points I had no ideas of, but I have been not a member but in touch with the Tunisian oligarchy before when I was a teenager. And I suspect I captured many things. For another part, both my grandfathers were notabilities in the village. I should not say France was an oligarchy, but my village was. I remember my maternal grandfather walking in the street with 30 heads of family following him, and all these people going to have a supper at my grandfather's house because my grandfather had killed a pig. So I always was in touch with that. Patrimonial problems, inheritance and so on, I never had to learn that. I drank them with the milk of my mother. You know, I am surprised to see how students or even colleagues are unable to understand this question. For me, very noble, obviously. I saw another kind of, Spain, Francoid Spain is a more complex experience.
But becoming part of this Tunisian oligarchy, did that change your perception of the Spanish oligarchy? Was there anything that clicked that suddenly,
well, compared to the Tunisian, the Spaniards were semi-oligarchs, let us say.
But the arbitristas, for example, arbitristas in Spain.
The arbitristas, it's a long time ago. Will not give you a course of Spanish history.
But I mean, you were asked to write reports in Tunisia.
Yeah.
But
exactly the same as I used to write to King Charles III in Spain. That is, here there is a problem, but being your Majesty, who His Majesty is, his will and goodwill, both are important, will obviously solve the problem.
And what is the purpose of these?
Being noticed by the chief. You know, the important when you have a chief is to be noticed by him, to do something. So if you send the best report of all.
But did you feel that need?
Yeah.
You felt that need?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why was it important for you that the president noticed you?
Because it is always funny in some ways. Well, you know, the head of a state in those countries is somebody everybody wants to be in touch with.
But you were French, living in
Yeah,
France.
but when I saw Spanish, Tunisian friends were trying to get in touch, and I knew that I was on a direct line with a line I never used to phone on. But if I wanted to phone the police, I know how to do it. And the wife of the president was certainly advanced, because she was a personal friend of my wife, and she knows she had an interest in knowing me. Once I was having supper with the Ministry of the Army.
But is it power that seduces? Is it the power that seduces? Does it draw you to it?
I was not drawn to, I was too aware of what, things were not going well as they had to. Now the power. Knowing you could do things others could not do.
Mm-hmm.
I never used it.
But there was still an attraction that made you write these reports.
Yes, it is a field of attraction,
Mhm.
and you feel absorbed. Quite a strange feeling, you know, and everybody who was in touch with a powerful man, fundamentally a dictator. It is something different.
But was it the man or was it the office? Was it personal charisma or was it the presidency?
The personal charisma of President Ben Ali was null. Simply. And this was his problem. Bolivar had charisma. He had known. You remember Jaruzelski in Poland? Well, he was ambassador of Tunisia at the time of Jaruzelski. And both looked like the other one. Exactly. You imagine? But, well, the expectancy of others, is fundamental for that. As I said before, when you know you got what they are longing for, we are children. Yeah, my ball is better than yours.
Okay, so last question. What are the 5 best or most important books that you have read?
First one, the Gospel. The second one, Milton's Sonnets. The third one, Baudelaire works. The fifth one, Combat pour l'Histoire of Lucien Febvre. The fourth one, and the fifth one, my dissertation.